All right, so now we're moving into conformity, compliance, and obedience. With the pack mentality, that's pretty self-explanatory. What is the pack mentality?
Together, eight strong.
Yes. So you have a group, and that grouping can change behavior because it can change interpretations of the behavior. How many of you have ever heard of mob rule? So with mobs, the individuals become de-individualized. People are going to behave in ways that they otherwise wouldn't on their own. That's because as you become a part of a group, you start losing your self-identity. You become meshed in with the group. So you're more likely to act out violently or aggressively according to whatever direction the mob is moving in. So that's where that pack mentality comes from. You stay with the pack and you conform to the pack, and you lose yourself and your individuality in the process. And to some extent, we are going to go along with this, like with the chameleon effect. Y'all know that chameleons can change colors to match their backgrounds. The chameleon effect in social psychology is when we tend to mimic other people's behaviors. Now, are we doing this on purpose? No, we do it unconsciously. You may find that you're sitting with somebody at lunch and they cross their arms, so you cross your arms. Or they put their head on their hand, and so you do the same. You start mimicking the behaviors of others. Kind of like in the classroom, I feed off of y'all's energy. So like fifth period, I was like, come on, guys. I asked, like, who did Hitler blame? There's dead silence. And I was like, y'all, who did Hitler blame for World War I? Okay, so I was not able to pull off that much energy. So with y'all, I'm able to mimic more of that energy and get us through this. So that's an unconscious tendency that occurs. There's also people who do it consciously in order to build rapport with others and thus make those people more susceptible to their suggestions. Susceptibility is when you're more likely to follow someone's suggestions. Basically, how hypnosis worked was if you believe hypnosis is real, then you can be hypnotized. If you don't believe hypnosis is real, then you can't be hypnotized. It all relies on suggestibility, that placebo effect. Now, conformity, like Nathan was talking about before, this is changing your behavior or thinking to coincide with the group's standard. Okay, so whatever group you are a part of. So if all of your friends are wearing masks when they go out, then you're more likely to adhere to that same policy. If your parents wear masks, then you're more likely to wear masks. It just kind of falls within that category. Keep in mind that conformity is when you change your behavior or thinking. You are adapting to the circumstances. So it's conditions that increase the chance of conformity. Well, number one, you have social insecurity. Let's say that you're with a group of friends and they start making fun of some other person in your class. Well, if you have low social security, if you feel like you're the extra in the group, maybe as an individual, you wouldn't bully somebody else. But because you want to maintain your status in the group, you're more likely to conform to their bullying of others. So de-individualization, pack mentality. You're unstable or insecure in your social standing, and so you're going to follow the group. The group over three. The larger a group, the harder it is to break from those standards. Y'all may remember from the Ash Line conformity study. There are 7 people in the study. 6 of them say the wrong answer. Then the 7th person is likely to say the wrong answer. But if a single person within that group decides, no, I'm going to go with answer B, then the pressure to conform is lessened to a degree. So groups, the more people in a group, the less likely you are to not conform. If the group is unanimous, you're likely to just go along with the flow, especially if you perceive that the whole group is unanimous. So for instance, if I asked y'all, do you want a pizza party or a Zaxby's party that's catered? And then everybody says Zaxby's. Well, what if Gavin really wants pizza? Then Gavin's probably not going to speak up and say, hey, I want pizza, because he knows the numbers are against him and he doesn't want to stand out. If you admire the group, that's pretty self-explanatory. If you have no prior commitment to a belief, if you just come across a group and you don't already have a set opinion on something, then you're more likely to conform because you have less stake in it. Like if in Mean Girls, they say, on Wednesdays we wear pink. Well, if you already have pink clothing and you don't particularly detest the color pink, then you're more likely to conform to that requirement that on Wednesdays we wear pink. If you're being observed, you're more likely to conform. Like if you know you're being observed at lunch and they're checking to make sure your noses are covered. I've seen like 2 kids, like one student I didn't even know. I walked by and they like put their mask up. So it's like interesting seeing that in play. The culture encourages respect for social standards. That depends on the culture as well. I remember when I was a senior, one of my peers didn't stand for the Pledge of Allegiance as like everyone else was. So it just seemed like this big deal, right? So going against the group, going against the standards for that society for what's acceptable versus unacceptable, it takes a lot because oftentimes we experience pressure to conform. And that if we don't conform to those social standards, then we stand the risk of being ostracized, which nobody wants to happen. So normative social influence, this is just saying we follow social norms because we don't want to stand out. Again, because it can run a risk of disapproval. So we're more likely to want to gain approval rather than lose that approval. However, different cultures have different standards. So for instance, in the United States, are you supposed to slurp your food or chew with your mouth open or burp? No, that's seen as rude. In other cultures, like in the Japanese culture, it's polite to eat with gusto to show appreciation. In Japan, it's polite to repeat a compliment 3 times to show that you're genuine about it. But if I repeat a compliment to you 3 times, you might be like, okay, I get it. Like, stop, you weirdo. I'm getting uncomfortable. Okay, so the topics we're going to cover are social facilitation and social inhibition. What this means is if you're in a group, what behaviors are going to get better versus what behaviors are going to get worse. The theory with that is the Yerkes-Dodson theory, the theory of arousal. Difficult tasks are going to be completed more effectively the fewer people there are around you. Easy tasks are easy to complete even if there are a lot of people around you. So we're going to go into detail about that. Social loafing. This is the belief that you don't have to contribute as much to the group because there's no way of measuring whether or not you contribute to the group. And then de-individuation is the loss of your identity to the group. So y'all, come up with one thing that people excel in doing when they're in front of people, or one thing that you do better when in front of people, versus one thing people do worse on when in front of people. So first, let's look at something that people can do really well in front of others. Sports. So if you play on a team, you've got to know how to play in front of people. If you're a cheerleader, you've got to know how to engage the crowd. You're supposed to be able to do flips and cheers and all of that in front of a group. Now, if you're a sports athlete, if you're an athlete or a cheerleader, you do practice. You're constantly practicing and doing drills and working on your cheers so they become second nature. If they become automatic, then it doesn't matter if you're in front of a group or not. You're still going to make that free throw. You're still going to do the cheer correctly. So that's an activity or a behavior that you can do in front of other people because you've done it so many times. What about an activity that people don't do as well on in front of people? All right, someone said debate. Speaking. Okay, I do that too. I'll be talking and then all of a sudden my tongue and mouth don't work right. And so I'll just stumble over words and I'm like, what? Why? Why is this happening? So speaking in front of people, staying on task in front of people, those could be behaviors that you would prefer to be alone rather than having to do in front of somebody else. For instance, if you're going to do a presentation, would you prefer to do it in front of the whole class or simply record it at home and then play it in front of the whole class? Most people are going to want to record it so that they don't make any mistakes in front of other people. There's a difference in this because of the idea of social inhibition and social facilitation. Again, this is a theory that's espoused by Robert Zajon. So social facilitation is the tendency for us to do better in a behavior when we're in front of others. So the presence of others increases arousal. Now remember, that just means interest. That just means the excitement level, not necessarily anything sexual. Okay, so the presence of others increases your arousal. We know that there's an optimal arousal theory. For difficult tasks, do you want high arousal or low arousal? Low arousal, because if your arousal gets too high, then you can't focus. But for easy tasks, you're going to want high arousal. Okay, so you can get through it. Like if you're running a mile, you may want to have earphones in. If you're writing an essay, are you going to want music blaring like Eye of the Tiger? Probably not. So that's with the different levels with the optimal arousal theory. So easy tasks are enhanced with more people around you. Difficult tasks are inhibited when there's more people in front of you. Tasks that are more likely to be socially facilitated are simple, well-learned responses: running a mile, playing basketball, cheering for a team. Whereas difficult tasks like writing an essay or giving a presentation, you don't want to have to do that in front of a lot of people because you get more nervous and you can't concentrate. For social inhibition, this is where we do worse because we're around other people. So these are complex or little practiced responses. So in my second period class, I may stumble over definitions more often because I haven't practiced the lecture yet. I'm going through my notes and remembering it from the last time I gave the lecture a year ago. But by the time I get to seventh period, do I pretty much have everything down pat? Yeah, because I've practiced it enough times. So it depends on how much you've done the behavior before and whether it's easy or complex. Now, social loafing, y'all are probably all very, very familiar with, because I'm sure that in some point in your educational career, you have had to do a group project. Okay, now the issue with group projects is that everybody in the group is supposed to get the same grade. And there are some people who know that and they take advantage of it. They may say, hey, I want so-and-so on my group because I know they'll do the entire project. I was one of those people that would do the entire project. So people constantly wanted to be on projects with me because they knew that they'd get an A. The reason that this occurs is because of social loafing. This is the idea that people in a group will extend less effort because they know that their effort can't be measured. How do teachers try to get around this with group projects? You'll do member evaluations, okay, giving feedback from your other group members saying, oh, so-and-so did the whole project or so-and-so didn't do their part, and that's why we were up until 2 a.m. completing the assignment. So they try to get around that idea of social loafing by providing a way to quantify how much effort a person has put into the project. But the fallback on that is sometimes with those feedback forms, people are too nice to say, hey, this person didn't do jack. And so they'll just put, okay, give them the full points, whatever, just move on. Part of the reason I don't do group projects. Also, if like there's plagiarism on the group project, it's like, well, who plagiarized it? I have to give everybody a 0 because I can't tell who cheated on this one particular part on this project. So I'm just like, do it individually. De-individuation is the loss of identity because you are participating in a group. So you have less personal responsibility. This is where we get the mob mentality and mob rule and the pack mentality because you're seen as a monolith. The entire group is acting rather than individuals within the group. So you see a loosening of normal constraints on behavior and an increase in impulsive and deviant acts. Because while you're in a group, you feel like you're blending in, and therefore you don't feel as accountable for your actions. More recently, you could probably associate this with the insurrection on the Capitol. You see a lot of people at the Capitol, a few people pass the barricades and start moving into the Capitol. What does everyone else do? They follow them in. Okay, the idea of mob mentality. If someone else is doing it, then it must be okay. Same thing like if your parents have ever told you, well, if all your friends jumped off a bridge, would you do it too? Well, I mean, with de-individuation and levels of conformity, there's a chance. That's how cults emerge, because of de-individuation and need for conformity and stability. Going back to Zimbardo's prison study, what happened in that prison study? Somebody summarize it for me. Exactly right. That's the Lucifer effect. You have college students that are randomly assigned the position of guard or position of prisoner. And what happened was they started fulfilling those stereotypical roles of what is a prisoner supposed to do and what is a guard supposed to do. So normal, non-sadistic individuals eventually became tormentors. They were punishing the prisoners and they were abusing the prisoners because they fulfilled what they considered the role of the prison system. With this role in de-individuation and role playing, how do you think the study would have been different if instead of emulating a prison with guards and prisoners, the study had emulated a hospital with nurses and patients? Would the students who are the nurses act the same way as the guards? No, why not? Yeah, you have to have bedside manner. You have to be compassionate if you're going to be a nurse or a doctor dealing with sick people. So the roles would be different. There's a stereotypical role of what nurses do versus what patients do, and there's a stereotypical role of guards versus prisoners. So the idea of roles can play an important part in behavior. So, like if you are playing the role of a student versus playing the role of a teacher, playing the role of a child versus the role of a parent, we have certain schemas for what those roles are supposed to entail and what our boundaries within those roles entail. Group polarization, groupthink, and altruism. Those are all very different things. Group polarization is where members of a group get more extreme or fanatical. Groupthink is where you don't perceive outside perceptions of things and everyone pretty much just agrees on everything so you don't get different perspectives. And then altruism is prosocial behavior that we do that benefits others. So we're going to go into detail about each of these. Group polarization is where we tend to flock together with people that we agree with. So this is kind of like where we get those echo chambers that we see on the internet. You're more likely to follow people who already believe what you believe. And so as a result, you're only getting one perspective or objective of a view. And so that's going to radicalize you and move you further and further away from the moderate medium opinion on something and more towards the extreme form of something. Okay, so people get more and more extreme as they act in isolation. This can be the example of, say, terrorist cells. The internet has played a very large role in group polarization because, again, you get those think chambers, those bubbles in your social media where you're not open to outside views. And so you only get reinforcement from things that you already believe. And eventually there are going to be more and more extreme views as you move further into radicalization. Now, this is known as risky shift. Risky shift is the tendency to shift from uncertainty about a task to making a decision with a greater risk after or following group discussion. So you're discussing something with a group, and then that can lead to riskier behavior. So kind of like if you're hanging out with friends outside and someone says, I bet you can't jump over that rock. And then y'all start discussing it and you start thinking, oh, okay, what if I get my motorcycle and I ride it over the rock? Like it just gets more and more extreme with more group discussion because you don't have as many limits. So that's leading into radicalization. Okay, and the reason it's called polarization is because you can be on opposite ends of the spectrum. You could be radical as, let's say, radical liberals or radical conservatives, but they're not going to fall into that middle group where most of the population tends to fall, about 68% of the population. The radical groups tend to fall into less than 2% of the population. With groupthink, this is what leads to group polarization. Groupthink leads to bad decisions because everyone assumes that the group supports the decision. Because people don't want to speak up if they think that the majority of the people are going along with the plan. This goes back to our conformity studies with the ash line experiments. Remember that there was one person at the end who knew what the right answer was, but because the other Confederates said this line or that line or the other line, they went along with what the group told them to do, even though they weren't pressured to do what the rest of the group had done. So groupthink is when you have group cohesiveness, the fact that the group gets along. And that's more important than considering the facts. Now, the problem with that is that the group will learn to support bad decisions. People are less likely to argue against a group decision, and they don't want to stand out and be ostracized from the group. So an example of this would be Pearl Harbor. Y'all may be familiar with the fact that Japan was in World War II fighting with the Nazis against the Allied forces, including Britain and France. But the United States had not yet gotten involved because they said, hey, we're neutral, we're staying out of this. That was until Japan made a direct attack on American territory, on Pearl Harbor. Now, what led up to that decision to bomb Pearl Harbor? Because very clearly, it did not work out well for the Axis. What it did do was tick off the Americans and get them involved in the war, first defeating Germany and then defeating Japan. Okay, so how did this come to be? Well, in these groupthink conditions, you typically see the following. You see a respected leader. So an example of that would be the Emperor of Japan with the Meiji Restoration. So because they followed their emperor and he was highly revered, he could have been, or he or his military generals would have been the ones making the decisions. And not many people want to go up against a military general or an emperor. High cohesion within the group, that we're looking at a collectivistic society rather than an individualistic society. Isolation of the group. Japan was famous for its period of isolation prior to 1863. High stress. Well, you're in the middle of the war. World War II is probably a high stress situation, so that could play a role. A stereotyped view of the opponents. During World War I and World War II, there was quite a bit of propaganda on both sides, okay, viewing or dehumanizing the enemy. The illusion of invulnerability, the belief that Japan could not lose because they had already defeated China so thoroughly with the rape of Nanking. Unquestioned morality of the group, the belief that they were superior to the other Asian nations and superior to the Allied powers. Pressure to conform is another condition, and illusion of unanimity, or the belief that everyone else is on the same page and you're the only one who dissents. All right, altruism. You've probably heard this word before in your Membeing series. Altruism is selfless, okay, as opposed to selfish. So altruism is the belief in being concerned for others, or the practice in being concerned for others without any goal for reward. So this is a prosocial behavior. It helps us with our social interactions. Helping others makes us more likable. However, there are some conditions in which we're less likely to help out others. Y'all have probably heard of the bystander effect. The bystander effect is the theory that if you're in a large group of people, you're less likely to help out somebody who's in distress. So a decreased likelihood that an individual will help a person in distress due to the presence of others. Now, why would that be true? Why would the presence of other people make us less likely to help somebody? How many of you have ever done CPR training? Okay, so when you're doing CPR training, they do like, okay, staying alive, the whole song thing. But they tell you that you need to tell somebody to call 911. How do they tell you to do that? Exactly right. You tell someone directly. You don't just yell out, somebody, anybody, call 911. You point at them and you say, hey, you call 911. You give them an instruction specific to them. Then they're more likely to carry it out because the responsibility has been put on them rather than just diffused to the whole group. The bystander effect works this way because if we're around a lot of people and we see somebody asking for help, we're more likely to ignore that person because we assume that somebody will do it. Somebody else will take care of it. And it's not our personal responsibility. Whereas if it were just us and this other person needing help, then we would feel like, okay, I'm the only one who can help, so I better go ahead and start helping. This is called the diffusion of responsibility. The presence of others makes us feel like, oh, hey, we don't have to do anything. This is kind of like with group projects that we talked about, where if you have a group, you can't measure individual effort. So there's always going to be that one person who's like, yeah, I'm not going to do any work. I'm going to rely on my group members to get me an A. Okay, so for the most part, the majority of the population falls under the bystander effect. But there are some people who fall under bystander intervention. This is where they have a tendency to help people despite the presence of others. So the bystander effect doesn't apply to them. So the optimum number of witnesses is you, just one person being able to help, because otherwise we make excuses of, oh, we don't need to help because someone else will do it. This is an example that's used, I'm pretty sure, in every class that ever discusses social psychology, but I do want to give a trigger warning for this. There is physical and sexual violence in this case study that we're about to look at. If any of those things is triggering to you, then you have my permission to not participate in this activity and instead read about it in your textbook. But if you want to stay and participate in this activity, I just wanted to give you a heads up before we get started. So what we're going to do is we're going to read the case study of Kitty Genovese. This event in history is going to lead to the development of the 911 system for calling emergency services for help. And it's also going to be a key case study in studying the bystander effect And why is it that the presence of others diffuses social responsibility? Now, in the process of going through this story, we're going to do FRQs or TAD for each of these terms. Social inhibition, dehumanization, frustration, aggression, fundamental attribution error, the just world phenomenon, the bystander effect, and informational social influence. Social inhibition is when the presence of others makes us less capable at a task or less competent at a task. To dehumanize someone means obviously to treat them as less than human or not to see them as a person. Frustration, aggression deals with an external frustration that leads to an aggressive behavior. Fundamental attribution error is a type of stereotyping where you stereotype a group as a certain way, whether it's based on gender, race, or what have you. The just world phenomenon is the idea of karma, or, things happen the way they happen for a reason. Good things happen to good people, bad things happen to bad people. Bystander effect, we just covered. People are less likely to intervene in the presence of others. And informational social influence is when you get information from the environment that affects your behavior. The Kitty Genovese case. March 13th, 1964, along a serene tree-lined street in the Kew Gardens section of Queens, New York City, Catherine Genovese began the last walk of her life in the early morning hours. She had just left work, and it was 3:15 a.m. when she parked her red Fiat in the Long Island Railroad parking lot 20 feet from her apartment door. As she locked her car door, she took notice of a figure in the darkness walking quickly toward her. She became immediately concerned as soon as the stranger began to follow her. As she got out of the car, she saw me and ran, the man told the court later. I ran after her, and I had a knife in my hand. She must have thought that since the entrance of her building was so close, she could reach safety within seconds. But the man was faster than she thought. The man caught up to Catherine, who was all of 5'1" and weighed just 105 pounds, near a street light at the end of the parking lot. I could run much faster than she could, and I jumped on her back and stabbed her several times, the man later told the cops. Oh my God, he stabbed me, she screamed. Please help me, please help me. Some apartment lights went on in nearby buildings. Irene Frost heard Catherine's screams plainly. There was another shriek, she later testified in court, and she was lying down crying out. Up on the 7th floor of the same building, Robert Moser slid open his window and observed the struggle below. Hey, leave that girl alone, he yelled into the street. The attacker heard Moser and immediately walked away. There was quiet once again in the dark. The only sound was the sobbing of the victim struggling to her feet. The lights in the apartment went out again. Catherine, bleeding badly from several stab wounds, managed to reach the side of her building and held onto the concrete wall. She staggered over to a locked door and tried to stay conscious. Within 5 minutes, the assailant returned. He stabbed her again. I'm dying, she cried to no one. But several people in her building heard her screams. Lights went on once again and some windows opened. Tenants tried to see what was happening from the safety of their apartments. The attacker then ran to a white Chevy Corvair at the edge of the railroad parking lot and seemed to drive away. On the 6th floor, Marjorie and Samuel Koshkin witnessed the attack from their window. I saw a man hurry to a car under my window, he said later. He left and came back 5 minutes later and was looking around the area. Mr. Koshkin wanted to call the police, but Mrs. Koshkin thought otherwise. I didn't let him, she later said to the press. I told him there must have been 30 calls already. Miss Andre Peak, who lived on the 2nd floor, heard the commotion from her window. I heard a scream for help 3 times, she later told the court. I saw a girl lying down on the pavement with a man bending over her, beating her. About 3:25 a.m., Catherine, bleeding badly, stumbled to the rear of her apartment building and attempted to enter through a back entrance. The door was locked. She slid along the wall until she reached a hallway leading to the 2nd floor of 8262 Austin Street, but she fell to the vestibule floor. In the meantime, the man had returned again. I came back because I knew I'd not finished what I set out to do, he told cops later. He walked along the first row of doors and calmly searched for the woman. He checked the first door and didn't find her. He followed the trail of blood to the doorway where Catherine lay bleeding on the tiled floor. And there, while the defenseless victim lay semi-conscious, incoherent from pain and loss of blood, he cut off her bra and underwear and sexually assaulted her. He then took $49 in cash from her wallet. Why would I throw money away? He asked the court at his trial. As Catherine moaned at his feet, probably unable to comprehend what had happened to her, the man viciously stabbed her again and killed her. The man, who had selected his victim purely at random, ran to his car, still parked where he left it. The entire event lasted at least 32 minutes. He said later that murder was an idea that came into my mind, just as an idea might come into your mind, but I couldn't put mine aside. Catherine was his 3rd murder. At about 3:50 a.m., a neighbor, Carl Ross, who lived on the second floor of Catherine's building in Austin Street, finally called the police. But before he did, he called a friend in nearby Nassau County and asked his opinion about what he should do. After the police were notified, a squad car arrived within 3 minutes and quickly found Catherine's body in the hallway on the first floor. She had been stabbed 17 times. Her torn and cut clothes were scattered about, and her open wallet lay on the floor next to her. Her driver's license identified her as Catherine Genovese. Detectives from the 112 responded and began an exhaustive investigation. A canvass of the neighborhood turned up several witnesses, including the one who had notified the police. When cops finished polling the immediate neighborhood, they discovered at least 38 people who had heard or observed some part of the fatal assault on Kitty Genovese. So looking back at these terms, how would social inhibition be applied to the case of Kitty Genovese? As a reminder, social inhibition deals with the Yerkes-Dodson arousal theory that more complex and difficult tasks are harder to do around people, but easy tasks are easy to do around people. There's not as much pressure. Social inhibition, which is when you do not feel pressured to do or say something, can be applied to the case because many people did not feel compelled to call the police. So how difficult is it to call the police? Is it easy or hard? Well, nowadays it's pretty easy, right? So if all you got to do is take out your cell phone and hit 3 numbers and call the police, under the social inhibition theory, you don't really have a lot of inhibition because it's something that's easy to do around others. So this case led to the implementation of the 911 system to make it easier for people to do that simple phone call to call for help. Because how long did it take the police to get to the apartment building after the call was made? 3 minutes. And the attack took over 30 minutes. So social inhibition, even if there are a lot of people, it's not really hard to call 911. How would dehumanization apply? Bystanders do not see Kitty as a person in need of help, but rather dehumanized her and was seen as just something that was unimportant or someone else will help. Dehumanization is when someone is not treated humanely, can be applied because Genovese called out for help and no one came to her aid. Okay, both of those are good examples. Over 38 people could hear or see what was happening to her and yet did nothing. Okay, because maybe they didn't know her. You know, you live in an apartment complex, you don't really get to know your neighbors, as opposed to if it were a suburb and you heard your neighbor yelling out. Okay, so she was dehumanized in that respect. She was also dehumanized by her attacker, who was viewing her as just a random murder, that he had gone out to kill her and he was going to finish what he had come out to do. So you see dehumanization on the part of the perpetrator and dehumanization on the parts of the witnesses. Frustration, aggression, that deals with hostile behavior, where you have an external frustration that then drives you to a behavioral aggression. Now, did the attacker illustrate any sort of frustration, or did he just randomly pick Kitty? He randomly picked her. He said, a thought just popped into my mind. That was his third murder. So he didn't really even see them as people, but he had something external that led to this drive, like drive reduction theory, that led to these behaviors, acting out this fierce aggression against this stranger. Fundamental attribution error. That is when we apply a stereotype or apply an idea that is erroneous, that is not correct. So the fundamental attribution error here is that people are naturally altruistic. The idea was that somebody will call. Y'all may remember the wife who told her husband, oh, don't call, they've probably already gotten 30 calls already, when in fact the police department hadn't received any calls about the attack on Kitty. So the fundamental attribution error there is that somebody will help. It doesn't have to be me. Just world phenomenon. What is that? Similar to karma. The idea that good things happen to good people and that bad things happen to bad people. Okay, so some people may have been able to justify not helping Kitty because they may have reverted to victim blame. What was this young woman doing out at 3 a.m? Well, she was working. Or old victim blaming of what were you wearing, what were you drinking, that sort of thing. Okay, do you know who's responsible for or what's the cause of rape? Rapists. Not what you're wearing, not what you're drinking, not what you say or do, because it's about power. And so that's the just world phenomenon. People probably thinking, oh, whoever's out there screaming or being attacked is probably deserving of what's happening to them. Bystander effect, obviously, that is a big part of what happened here because it's what helped coin the term bystander effect, that if you have a lot of people or witnesses, that the diffusion of responsibility ultimately leads in people not doing what they're supposed to do because they believe that somebody will do it and it's not on them. And then informational social influence, that's non-coercive information that you get to help make decisions on what's going on. In this example, you could have that guy who called the police who first called his friend to see what he should do. Okay, so he called his friend and then got feedback on what he should do, and then he called the police. That's non-coercive information about the situation that led to a certain behavior. Now we're going to move into some other principles in social psychology, the social exchange theory, the idea of social scripts or schema that we follow, the reciprocity norm, which is just fun to say, reciprocity, and the social responsibility norm. So first up, we have the social exchange theory. This is how we define our relationship with another person. This is defined based on what we put in to the relationship versus what we get out of the relationship. Are we putting in more or are we getting more from the relationship? The cost benefits analysis. What kind of relationship we think we deserve and the chances of having a better relationship with somebody else. Okay, the grass is greener on the other side. Like you have a boyfriend or a girlfriend, but you're just like, hey, how do they spell their number over there? Okay, so we try to base our relationships off of what we get out of the relationship and what we put in, our own perception of ourselves, our perception of the other person, and, the Russian roulette of can we do better or is this the best that I'm going to do? Also in the social exchange theory, in interacting with others, we often try to decrease their discomfort or their embarrassment as a type of reciprocity because this helps release endorphins. Like if anyone in your friend group has ever said something like super dumb or embarrassing and you just don't say anything about it, y'all just move on because you're like, okay, I don't want to embarrass them because that wouldn't feel good for me. So I'm going to give into this relationship. It's part of the reason why watching The Office can be so difficult sometimes because Michael Scott does some just absolute clown shoes stuff that you feel like secondhand embarrassment. That secondhand embarrassment is real, where you're like, I'm not even the one who did the stupid thing, and yet I still feel as embarrassed, as if I did the stupid thing. So we try to preserve other people from feeling that level of embarrassment as a part of this cost benefits analysis in our social exchange. Within this, we also follow certain social scripts. These are steps that we follow in social situations. For instance, when you go to a restaurant, you go to the front where there's a greeter and then they seat you. Do you go up to the front and immediately order something? No, you go and sit down. Then when the waiter or waitress comes up to you, they ask you what you want to drink. Then they go away. Then they come back and ask you what you want to eat. Then they go away. And then they may ask for dessert. They may hand a check to somebody. Typically in a patriarchal society, they're going to hand the check to the man as opposed to the woman, or they're going to hand the check to the older person as opposed to the younger person. So these are scripts that we follow in day-to-day life that we may not even be aware of. However, we can change those scripts. So having new mental instructions for how to deal with an experience after we've gone through it. So like in this example with child psychology, trying to teach a child how to cope with their anger and not take it out on others. So you can learn from past experiences from oh, I did it wrong that way. In the future, I'm going to stop and do this instead. So you can revamp your social scripts. But for the most part, these are very, very strong instructions for how we're supposed to act in society. And they're often just, unconsciously moved into our psyche rather than something that we actually study. The reciprocity norm is just a fancy way to say the golden rule. Treat others the way you want to be treated. That's it. This is the expectation that if we act nice to people, then they in turn will act nice to us. So people will respond favorably to each other by returning benefits for benefits. So you scratch my back, I scratch yours. If you're a turd to me, then I will in turn be a turd to you. And we will see who can be the bigger turd. This also ties into social responsibility norm, where it's not just about reciprocity. It's not just about what can I get out of this by being nice to somebody, but it's the idea that you have an obligation to help others. So those who are able to take care of themselves have a duty or an obligation to assist those who cannot. And this is something that's noticeable in the human species. Like, we have remains from ancient human ancestors that lived to an older age, even though they had a broken leg, or they couldn't hunt, or they couldn't gather. So even prior to the Neolithic Revolution, within the human species, we saw a value in taking care of people who couldn't necessarily contribute to the survival of the group. So that idea of social responsibility, not just the cost-benefit analysis of social exchange theory, but moving beyond that and including some altruism.